Chapter 3, The Experimentalists, Part 3, Prelude to Pasteur. While Louis Pasteur was growing up, several more people made minor accomplishments of their own and helped to lay the foundation for Pasteur. One of them provided a powerful upgrade to the primary tool of the microscope hunter, while others finally began to find concrete clues about the something out there, the external agent that was causing disease. So far in our story, we have focused almost entirely on the discovery of microbes, and we have said nothing about disease. Except for the itch mite, there has been no solid evidence for any connection between microscopic organisms and human diseases. But that is about to change. The first germ? Who should receive credit for making the first connection between microbes and disease? Establishing priority in scientific issues can often be a tricky business, with plenty of room for nuance. In the discovery of germs, the credit for establishing the first correlation between a disease and a microscopic life form should probably go to Redi's friend Giovanni Cosimo Bonomo. The credit for establishing the first solid example of a disease having a living external cause should probably go to one of Spallanzani's students, Agostino Bassi. Bassi studied law to satisfy his parents, but he was fascinated by the natural world, and he took many classes in science, math, and medicine in school, some of them from Spallanzani. He began his adult life with an office job, but he eventually quit that job to take up a full-time career in agriculture. He applied his interests and skills in careful experimental science, and he wrote several authoritative and helpful books for growers. He helped shepherds to understand scientific ways to care for sheep, and he helped growers to produce quality potatoes, cheese, and wine. And for over 30 years of his adult life, he was perplexed by a bizarre disease of silkworms. Sometimes the silkworms populating the mulberry orchards of silk growers had epidemics of their own and died in droves. Sometimes their corpses became covered in a weird white, somewhat powdery crust. Bassi tried to apply the methods of careful experimentation to the problems of the silkworm, but without much success at first. When he was almost ready to give up on the problem, he noticed something. Most doctors and scientists at the time believed that diseases develop internally due to internal disturbances or imbalances of some kind, and Bassi had been proceeding on that assumption. But, perhaps inspired by his predecessor Redi and his carefully controlled jars, he then realized that an outside agent was necessary. Isolated worms did not get sick. Something had to enter their bodies from the outside. Did it have something to do with the crusty coating? He tried pricking the healthy silkworms with a little of the powdery coating taken from a dead silkworm. They quickly died. Often they would then develop a crusty coating of their own. Bassi found the same thing happened if he tried pricking the pupae, or if he pricked the adult moth. This powder was toxic to silkworms of any stage, but it was more than toxic. It could grow into new powder. It was reproducing. It was alive. Bassi realized, after examining the powder through a microscope, that it was a kind of fungus. But this one was a parasitic fungus. Most common molds and mushrooms feed on things that are already dead, but this parasitic mold killed a living animal and then fed on the corpse. Bassi had discovered the first example of a contagious disease being spread by the passage of a microscopic parasite from one host to the next. He never imagined to give a detailed description of the fungus or to identify the exact species. Unlike the eunuch, Bassi did not have a very good eyesight. His failing vision may have been one of the reasons he resigned from his office job. But Bassi gave to history the first parasitic theory of disease, backed by evidence. Bassi had shown for the first time that an invisible life form, or at least its invisible seeds or spores, could cause disease in a larger organism. For this, Bassi has his own place in the honorable intellectual tradition. The species of fungus was later identified and named Botrytis bassiana in Bassi's honor, and Pasteur would later hang Bassi's portrait on his wall as well, alongside that of Spallanzani. Hospital problems. In the 19th century, most women gave birth at home, where they were attended by midwives, and very few died. However, those without money or with additional health problems would often give birth in the charity ward of a hospital. The need to go to the hospital must have been terrifying, because women would frequently develop severe fevers while they were there, and many would die. Death rates over 10% were not uncommon in obstetrics wards. It was called childbed fever or puerperal fever. It was awful, but nobody knew why it was happening or what to do about it, so it continued. Outside the hospitals, almost no women ever got childbed fever. In 1844, 26-year-old Hungarian-born Ignaz Semmelweis graduated from the University of Vienna as a physician. 2 years later, he was appointed first assistant of obstetrics in Vienna General Hospital, and he noticed something curious about the death rates of women in his hospital. Vienna General Hospital has two divisions, and one of them had a death rate that was about 3 times higher than the other. Other people had noticed this before, but nobody had been able to make much of it. Semmelweis was appalled by the deaths, and he decided to attack the problem. He began the laborious task of conducting autopsies of every woman who died in the hospital. His hospital had been keeping detailed statistics since it opened in 1784, so Semmelweis also started poring through the records to see if he could find any interesting differences between the two divisions of obstetrics in his hospital. There weren't any, except one. The conditions and practices were virtually identical between the two wards, except for the people. The ward with the higher death rate was being used for teaching purposes, and the women there were being attended to by medical students instead of midwives. Were the medical students somehow giving the women the deadly fever, like his predecessors? Semmelweis couldn't understand it. In 1847, as if Semmelweis didn't have enough death around him, his friend, the forensic pathologist, was accidentally cut during an autopsy, developed a fever, and died shortly after. But death does not stop the pursuit of knowledge. Semmelweis reviewed the autopsy of his friend and discovered similarities to childbed fever. That's when it clicked. Both medical students and forensic pathologists handled cadavers. It seemed as if something from the cadavers had been introduced into the pathologist's cut and was being introduced into pregnant women by the medical students, and this something had made them all sick. Most doctors at the time attributed childbed fever, like most diseases, to some kind of internal flaw. Semmelweis realized that this hospital disease was being caused by an outside agent, something originating in cadavers and being transferred by contact. Semmelweis called this, whatever it is, cadaverous particles. In those days, medical examinations were done without gloves. Doctors and medical students would wash their hands in soap and water, as you might wash your hands before dinner, but that was all, and that was not enough to remove the cadaverous particles. Semmelweis could tell it wasn't enough because the smell of rotting corpses remained on the medical students' hands. Semmelweis set out to find a way to completely cleanse the hands of anyone who examined patients. He experimented with several cleaning agents and settled on a solution of chlorinated lime, similar to common chlorine bleach, as most effective in removing the cadaver smell. He obtained permission from his boss to change the rules for the medical students and instructed them to wash their hands in the solution between autopsies and the medical examinations. The death rates dropped dramatically. Semmelweis had saved lives. But then the rate spiked again a couple of times, and Semmelweis realized that the contamination can come not only from cadavers, but also sometimes from the patients themselves, if they had gangrene or some other smelly, pus-producing, rotting disease. Semmelweis concluded that the cause of childbed fever was not strictly cadaverous material, but any kind of decaying or animal organic matter. When all kind of animal flesh rots, that rot can cause rotting disease if it enters a healthy person. Semmelweis now instructed students to wash their hands in bleach between every patient. and not just when entering the ward, and to isolate any patients that risked contaminating the general environment. Death rates dropped back down to low levels and stayed there. Semmelweis never found recognition in his lifetime. Caring for patients was his primary job, not scientific research, and he never identified or described any kind of germ. He could only call them particles. He never gave any evidence about the nature of these particles or how they cause disease. In scientific terms, he only established a correlation between hand washing and disinfectant and lowered death rates. Most doctors still believe that childbed fever was due to internal causes, and a few were even offended at the idea that their hands were unclean. But the statistics were clear. Everywhere Semmelweis went, death rates due to childbed fever plummeted. In the 19th century, Western civilization no longer had one dominating central authority telling everyone what to believe and punishing those who disagreed. But the specter of authority could still cast its shadow over clear thinking, even among scientists. Sometimes it is easier to insult an outsider or dismiss him as a crank than it is to defend your own ideas. Sometimes it is easier to wrap yourself in tradition than it is to formulate a rational argument. It is too easy to lose the thrill of exploration, of seeing the world clearly, and of thinking for yourself that energized Galileo's descendants. It is too easy to settle into desiccated bureaucratic mindset. I fear there are dark streaks of authority running through colleges and medical schools to this day. Galileo had had to fight against papal authority. Redi and Spallanzani had had to fight against sloppiness. Semmelweis had to fight against authority in his own profession. Tragically, Semmelweis lost. Ignaz Semmelweis eventually went mad, was forcibly confined to a mental institution, was beaten by the guards, and died from an infection shortly thereafter. The next generation of microscopes. In the 18th century, the world was more or less given up on Leeuwenhoek's single-lens design of microscope because it was inconvenient to use and it was hard on the eyes. For the best results, one had to have sharp natural eyesight, which Leeuwenhoek probably had. On the other hand, the two-lens design started to show colored fringes above magnification of 30 or 40 or so. In effect, when you demanded too much strength from the lenses, they started to act like prisms, turning the image into wet watercolor paintings. The two-lens microscopes were useless at high power. In 1824, an English wine cellar and natural history enthusiast named J. Lister decided to see if he could make each lens out of two different kinds of glass, the second one correcting the mistakes of the first. He succeeded and thus invented the first achromatic lens. These do not act like prisms even at high magnifications. With a pair of achromatic lenses, two-lens microscopes could give comfortable, roomy viewing windows with crystal clear images at magnifications well beyond even Leeuwenhoek's microscopes. Thanks to Lister, the next generation of microscopes was born, and the optical microscope took on the modern design we know today. These powerful modern microscopes could now make out structures. Were they internal organs? Inside the larger animalcules, and they could give a much better look at the tiniest of animalcules, such as the one Leeuwenhoek found in his teeth. An ocean of whales and minnows, we could finally get a good look at the minnows. By 1850, with the aid of the improved microscopes, the short bestiary of microbes had grown into a large catalog, organized crudely into categories by size and shape. In Pasteur's day, grouping and naming microfamilies was still a messy business, but there were a few broad categories. There were the huge whales of the microbe world with complex shapes and visible internal organs. These were the protozoans. There were also swarms or colonies of tiny rods, bacilli, tiny spheres, micrococcus, and tiny spiros, spirillum and spirocheta. Modern readers may be familiar with the names streptococcus and staphylococcus. Those are tiny spheres that grow in long strings resembling chains of beads, and tiny spheres that grow in clusters resembling clumps of grapes. Collectively, all these minnows where simple shapes come to be known as bacteria. In 1850, armed with a heritage of careful experimentation and a new generation of microscopes, Louis Pasteur was about to show for the first time what these microbes could do. Pasteur and the lives of microbes. In the early 1850s, Louis Pasteur finished his education in chemistry and physics, and he began to climb the ranks of French academia. In 1856, French sugar beet growers were having problems with their ferments, and they decided to seek the advice from science. Apparently, sugar beets are good for making rum. They enlisted young Pasteur to attack their problem. Fermentation was the name given to the foamy process that turns sugar into alcohol, and who better than a chemist to study what happens when fermentation goes wrong? Wine and milk. To ferment a batch of alcohol, the beet growers would honor their traditions, boil their beets, follow their recipes, and mix up their mashes in the prescribed way in the prescribed containers, and they would usually be rewarded with a batch of fermented beetroot alcohol. But sometimes the ferment would go bad, and for no apparent reason, the distillers would end up with a batch of sour juice instead of the desired alcohol. Pasteur, trained as a chemist, easily discovered that what was making the bad batches taste sour. They contained the acid of sour milk, or as chemists say now, lactic acid. But where had it come from? Somehow there had been a different conversion process, one that produced lactic acid when it should have produced alcohol. What was the cause of the different outcomes? Pasteur decided to see if he could find any interesting differences under the microscope. From a successful fermentation, he scooped up a little of the froth and placed it under the lens of a microscope. When the picture came into focus, he saw, not animalcules, but something new. There were weird globules just sitting there. In the microbic ocean of whales and minnows, these oval globs were quite small, but still a few times larger than the minnows. Pasteur had discovered a new globular kind of microorganism a little larger than bacteria. He had discovered the yeasts. Actually, he had rediscovered yeasts. In 1835, the French physicist Charles Carnier de Tours had examined brewer's yeast under a microscope and observed the globules. He had even realized that the globules were alive because he saw them reproduce, but they reproduced in a strange way. When a microbe reproduces by division, it pinches itself across the middle to form two equal halves. Carnier de Tours observed tiny little nubs start on one side of the yeast, grow larger and larger, and eventually detach itself. Carnier de Tours had discovered that yeast reproduced by budding, and this reproduction of living yeast probably had something to do with the process of fermentation. But what? In his good ferments, Pasteur rediscovered the yeast and the budding. What would he find in the bad ferments? From a sour ferment, he scooped up a little of the froth and placed it under the lens. When the picture came into focus, he saw tiny, rod-shaped things, even smaller than the yeast. Were they a new kind of living bacilli? Pasteur realized he needed to try to grow them. If they were living bacteria, he should be able to find a healthy soup that they can live in, and he should be able to raise a crop of them in the laboratory. But he also needed a clear soup so he could watch them while they grew and lived. He tried pure sugar water, but the rods didn't like that. Eventually, he came up with a recipe for a clear broth that made the strange rods grow. Whenever he introduced the rods to the broth, they multiplied, and the more they multiplied, the more acid of sour milk appeared. Not only were the rods alive, they were manufacturing the lactic acid as they grew. Why did they make acid? Did it serve a defensive purpose, or was it simply a waste product, the microbial equivalent of urine? In any case, the lactic acid was coming from the bacilli as a natural part of their living processes, just as the alcohol was coming from the yeast as a natural part of their living processes. Wherever there were yeast, There was alcohol, growing in quantities as the yeast grew and reproduced, and wherever there were bacilli, there was the acid of sour milk growing in quantity as the bacilli grew and reproduced. A culture of yeast or a culture of bacilli is a living chemical factory. By isolating the bacilli, figuring out how to cultivate them, and studying them separately in their own test tube, Pasteur, the experimentalist, had finally shown that microbes were meaningful. One microbe alone might be as irrelevant as a speck of dust, but en masse, microbes could change the world. Swarms of them can manufacture so much liquid that it makes a difference to us in our familiar world outside the microscope. Brewers have been unknowingly relying on microbes, or have been unknowingly frustrated by them all along. Converting sugar into alcohol is what yeasts do, and converting it into lactic acid is what these bacilli do. Now we know Pasteur's rods by the name lactobacilli, and lactic acid fermentation is their lifestyle. Along with other lactic acid bacteria, they are important resident in the digestive tracts of many animals, and they are used to ferment foods from yogurt to kimchi. Today we generally think of them as good bacteria, and they are included as a major component of many popular probiotic products. The spoilage of food and of people. But there are still exceptions. Sometimes Pasteur would attempt to grow the bacilli and perform lactic acid fermentation on purpose. You can do this yourself. Chop up a cabbage, pour some salt over it, crush it in your hands until it gets mushy, place it in a jar, and press the air out of it as best you can, and then let it sit in the dark. A week later, you'll have sauerkraut, full of lactic acid bacteria. But sometimes instead of sour acid, there was the smell of rancid butter. Was this yet another kind of fermentation? When Pasteur examined this new smelly ferment under the microscope, he found a new kind of microbe. 3 different chemical products, 3 different microbes, 3 different kinds of fermentation. Then the global power of microbes must have started to come together in Pasteur's mind. Many chemical processes, the fermentation of foods and beverages, the souring of milk, the rancification of butter, are actually all the work of living microbes. What about the rapid spoilage of unpreserved food? What about the composting of kitchen waste into soil? Where do all the leaves of fall go before the winter is over? What causes corpses to disappear and leave only skeletons? What if microbes were responsible for all of it? What if microbes are responsible for every kind of decay and decomposition that goes on in every kind of organic material everywhere in the world? The souring of milk is a kind of fermentation similar to alcohol fermentation, and also similar to putrefaction, the smelly decay of organic animal matter. And living microscopic organisms are responsible for all 3 conversions. Maybe all fermentation, all putrefaction, and all decomposition of all organic matter everywhere is the work of different kinds of microbes going about their normal lives. If so, then microbes don't alter the world just a little bit. They terraform the globe. In all the world, in all the soil, in the corpses of every plant and animal that nature has ever produced, some chemical agent must be responsible for digesting that matter, for causing it to decay, for reducing it to raw ingredients, and for creating the soil from which the next generation of life can emerge. If this did not happen, new life would not be possible. The globe would be a landfill packed with every dead plant and animal that ever existed. Something recycles the matter from every generation of life and prepares the nutrients for the next generation. That something is microbes, and Pasteur's vision saw it for the first time. And what about diseases? If microbes were responsible for the spoiling of food, could they spoil people as well? If microbes could transform the soil of the world, could they transform our insides too? Maybe microbes weren't so innocent and blameless of disease after all. In Pasteur's time, there were several hospital diseases that were becoming more and more problematic. Childbed fever was one example, but there were other smelly, colorful, pus producing, and fever inducing hospital problems, such as gangrene, erysipelas, and pyemia. As hospitals became more and more common in the 18th and 19th centuries, more and more of their patients had various parts seemed to rot away while the patient was still alive. And more people began to see that these rotting diseases bore a certain resemblance to putrefaction. If microbes are responsible for decomposing animal matter in the wild, could they also be responsible for causing living flesh to decompose? Could Semmelweis's corpse particles actually be living microbes of decomposition, carried from corpses or from the pus of living patients to other patients? People in hospitals often have their insides exposed, whether due to traumatic injury or deliberate surgery. Maybe these openings allow microbes of decomposition inside the bodies of hospital patients, and then the microbes try to decompose their insides? Maybe all of those fever-inducing and pus-producing hospital diseases were due to an input of microbes, or as we now say, bacterial infections. Infection derives from the Latin for to put in. Pasteur began to see the global power of microbes both for good and for ill. But where were all these microbes coming from? When there is a fresh wound or an open container of sterile beetroot mash, the microbes of putrefaction or the microbes of fermentation appear without being added. No other substance touches the wound or the mash. The microbes just appear. How could they get there? This brings us to the final eruption of the spontaneous generation debate, in which Louis Pasteur finally settled the issue of where microbes come from. The swan neck flasks. Pasteur, like Spallanzani before him, did not believe that microbes could appear without parents. But if that were true, then there was only one other possible explanation for the appearance of microbes in places where there were no microbes before. They must be able to fly. Maybe not fly, but maybe they can drift through the air like motes of dust. Most microbes are swimmers. They can stand drying out and float alone through the air. If not, could they hitch a ride on a droplet of mist or on a wet particle of dust? Pasteur wanted to show once and for all that microbes cannot come from nothing. They must enter new areas by traveling through the air. But now Pasteur had a problem similar to Francesco Redi's. If he simply sealed a bottle and sterilized it, no microbes showed up. Would that really prove that they can't be generated spontaneously? His opponents would argue that the sterilization damaged the air somehow, or that the microbes need fresh air to breathe. Pasteur needed to figure out a way to allow fresh air to enter the bottle, but to keep dust out. Pasteur's solution? The famous swan neck flask. The broth would rest in a glass globe equipped with a long, narrow neck. The fine neck would allow air to pass through, but it would prevent wind from blowing dust or debris into the interior. To prevent dust from falling down the neck under gravity, the neck arched up and over and back down again. Dust would have to fall up to reach the interior of the flask, and dust can't do that. So fresh air could pass in and out through the long, narrow, twisty neck, but no dust could blow or fall in. Pasteur boiled his broth in a fancy flask, and then waited. After several days, despite the fact that the rich, nourishing broth had been exposed to open air, there were no microbes. Could he be sure the broth was actually healthy for microbes? In the spirit of Francesco Redi's controlled experiments, Pasteur carefully broke off the curved portion of the neck, allowing dust to settle in through the newly exposed opening in the top of the flask. A few days later, the broth was full of microbes. As long as the neck was intact, the broth would stay sterile. But as soon as he broke the neck and let dust fall in, microbes began to grow. The broth was a good home for microbes, but they couldn't appear there unless they could float in the dust. The same thing happened when Pasteur tilted the flask. As long as the flask remained upright, no microbes appeared inside, but as soon as he sloshed some broth into the U-shaped part of the neck, where some dust had collected, washing the dust into the broth, microbes began to appear in the broth. With controlled experiments, Pasteur had finally shown how new microbes can appear in formerly sterile places. They can float in with the dust in the air. Pasteur even developed his own method for testing the air in different places to see how many and what kinds of microbes it contained. It was a sort of low-tech air purity tester. He prepared many sterile flasks with broth. He sealed them by infusing the glass, as Spallanzani had done, and he did it while the broth was at full boil, so that there would be a vacuum inside when it cooled down again. These flasks were his air testers. He would take them to whichever air he wished to test, then break the necks. Air would rush in to fill the vacuum, and then Pasteur would simply reseal them and incubate them. If the air had been full of microbes, the broth would soon turn cloudy. If the air had been clean, the broth would remain clear. He used such flasks to show that the air outdoors was full of microbes, but the air in a clean and calm storage vault was relatively microbe-free. He also climbed a mountain, stopped several times along the way, and showed that the higher he climbed on the mountain, the fewer microbes there were in the air. Pasteur showed that microbes can travel through the air with the dust, and he finally convinced the world that microbes were not spontaneously generated. And like Reddy's works with parasites, this gave hope to humanity. Microbes follow rules, and this means we can try to control them. Whenever you leave food lying around in the open, it quickly spoils. Yet you can keep cans of tuna and cans of soup on your shelf for months or even years. Why? Because microbes are mostly the cause of the spoilage, but they can't pass through the walls of the cans, and they also can't appear spontaneously inside. If microbes could appear spontaneously, we would have no defense against them. But Pasteur showed us that they can't, which meant that we could invent ways to sterilize and seal foods and beverages in airtight containers, and fill our shelves with long-lasting preserved food. Pasteur himself, in his earlier work with fermentation, had invented a way to kill yeast in wine without damaging the wine. He gently heated it, using a process we now call pasteurization. Pasteur had shown that microbes cannot appear in any place that they cannot enter, and this meant that we could defend ourselves against them. We could throw up walls and keep them out of places we didn't want them, and if we could preserve food by keeping microbes out of food containers, could we also preserve people by keeping microbes out of their interiors? Antiseptic surgery. J.J. Lister, the man who invented the achromatic lens and revolutionized the microscope, had a son who revolutionized surgery. As a child, little Joseph Lister absorbed his father's interest in natural science and in microscopes. Then he grew up and became a professor of surgery at the University of Glasgow. Like many doctors of the time, he lamented the state of his own profession. Hospital diseases were still widespread, and half of all surgeries ended in death. Then Lister read about Pasteur's work with microbes. Were hospital diseases being caused by microbes of decay entering open wounds? If so, then preventing them should be a simple matter of killing any microbes that were already in the wound, and then keeping the air and the surgical instruments sterile. Once the germs were gone, they could not spontaneously reappear in the wound, and if you were careful, you could keep new germs from floating in on the dust. Pasteur had given Lister a way to save his patients. But there was still a pretty big problem. Killing microbes is easy, but how in the world do you kill microbes in a wound without killing the patient too? Lister had to find a cleansing agent that would kill germs, but without damaging the patient's own flesh too much. The diseases of decay were sometimes called septic diseases, from a Greek word meaning to rot, or to make rotten. What Lister needed to do was to find a suitable anti-rotting agent, or antiseptic, one that would prevent the infection and the rotting without harming the patient. The processing of coal and the burning of organic matter produce a variety of tars and other related substances, many of which have preservative properties. One of them is creosote, which was named after smoked meat and has long been used to treat railroad crossties and telephone poles to keep them from rotting. A closely related preservative recently discovered in Lister's time is a substance now called phenol. In 1865, Lister settled on phenol as an effective antiseptic agent. He developed a careful procedure for swabbing wounds with this disinfectant, and he started disinfecting his surgical patients while keeping his surgical room as clean as possible. His ideas and techniques were mocked at first, but in a few years his surgical death rate dropped from 45% to 15%. A decade later, the rate was down to 5%. Joseph Lister saved countless lives, saved limbs from amputation, saved the king from appendicitis, and vindicated Ignace Semmelweis. He was honored with titles, medals, and statues from several nations, and his name is now immortalized in medicine cabinets everywhere on the label of a popular mouthwash. If you wander through a sparkling sanitary modern hospital and you smell that hospital smell, you're probably smelling phenol. That's the smell of salvation from rotting death, and you can thank Joseph Lister for it. French silkworms. Hospital diseases or septic diseases were now solidly linked to bacteria. Semmelweis's cadaverous particles were real, and they were alive. They were simply the microbes of decay that are found everywhere in decomposing organic matter. Modern readers may be familiar with strep throat or a staph infection. Pasteur observed and described both Streptococcus and Staphylococcus bacteria, and he associated them in a general way with diseases of decay. They were spread throughout nature, and they cause disease when they are accidentally get inside a living body, where they attempt to decompose the living flesh while it is still in use. They can be deadly if allowed to remain inside. But under most circumstances, our bodies are quite capable of making sure they stay outside where they belong. And even if they get in the modern world, we can usually eliminate them easily with antibiotics. Fortunately, these microbes are not out to get us. Their way of life is to decompose organic matter, not to attack us specifically. When we have an infection, they are doing the right thing, just in the wrong place. But what about more hostile microbes? Are there parasitic microbes whose way of life is to feed on us? Are different kinds of plague or contagion due to different species of parasitic germ spreading from host to host? Pasteur thought so, but he knew he needed proof if he was going to convince the rest of the world. While Lister was working out his new procedure for antiseptic surgery, the French silk industry was suffering from problems similar to those of the Italians a few decades earlier. French silkworms were being ruined by the millions by disease, and the silk industry's revenue had plummeted to a tiny fraction of what it once was. In 1865, the French Minister of Culture asked Pasteur to return his attentions to the problem. Pasteur initially resisted. He was a chemist and had no medical training. However, he knew that if he was ever going to prove his germ theory, he needed experimental evidence, and the silkworm disease might make a suitable test case. He eventually accepted the job. He set out to find the culprit and pin the blame on the guilty germ. Unfortunately, the diseases of French silkworms were a little like the Gordian knot. Silkworms suffer from multiple diseases with different causes, and at least two of them were active in Pasteur's time. Sometimes the diseases affect the eggs, the worms, and the adult moths differently. Pasteur never did untangle the knot and conclusively link a single specific disease with a single parasitic microbe. But like Alexander, Pasteur found a way to cut through the knot and move on. With his microscope and his experiments, Pasteur showed that the diseases were transmissible and were due to living agents spreading from one worm to worm. Even if he didn't know for sure which living agents caused which disease, he at least figured out a way to identify which creatures were sick and keep them from infecting the healthy ones. The following year, the growers enjoyed a splendid yield of silk, and life in the French silk industry could begin to return to normal. The germ theory. The pioneers of the microscope had opened up the microcosm with diligence and detailed documentation. With thorough testing, the experimentalists had shown that microbes were more or less normal living things. They might eat and reproduce in weird ways, but they still needed to eat and reproduce. But before Pasteur, microbes were still curiosities that existed only inside a scientist's microscope, as insignificant to humanity as specks of dust. Outside the laboratory, they were still invisible and unrecognized. With extensive, carefully controlled experiments, Louis Pasteur had shown that microbes change the world. They consume and emit materials just like any other living thing, and their collective chemical processing is constantly reforming the globe. Microbes are not like flakes in a snow globe. They are like flakes of snow. Each one may be tiny and insignificant, but collectively they can transform nature. Pasteur also showed us that the different microbes do different things. They're not random chaotic clowns of nature. Each kind of microbe has its own anatomy, its own habits, its own needs, and its own effects, just like any other living species. And Pasteur finally convinced the world, or the vast majority of it at least, that microbes cannot be spontaneously generated. Microbes must come from parents like any other living thing. But do microbes actually cause human epidemics? Are the outbreaks that plague humanity due to microscopic parasites passing from host to host? Microbes cause fermentation and putrefaction, including the diseases of putrefaction that appear in unsanitary hospitals. And some kinds of microbes seem to be responsible for the mess of illnesses that appear in silkworms. It was not a huge leap to assume that infectious human diseases are caused by parasitic microorganisms, each disease by its own seed or germ. Pasteur became convinced, and seeing the cause of infectious disease, he also saw the solution. He had shown that even microbe parasites cannot appear spontaneously inside a host, and if that was true, then humanity finally had a way to attack its deadliest problem. Humanity would finally have a defense against the wrath of pestilence. Pasteur began promoting his germ theory and became a crusader against germs. He delivered passionate lectures to his students on the subject and announced to the public, quote, "It is in the power of man to make parasitic maladies disappear from the face of the globe. For if the doctrine of spontaneous generation is wrong, as I am sure it is," unquote. But it was still an assumption. There still had been no conclusive proof and no definitive link between human epidemics and microscopic parasites. There was still no knowledge of specific germs and no way to diagnose specific diseases, much less cure them. By some accounts, Pasteur could be prone to streaks of arrogance and pettiness. I do not know. I cannot claim to be an expert in the life or personality of Pasteur. But most of what I have read about Pasteur written by those who knew him portrays him as a caring, thoughtful man and a passionate defender of the truth when necessary. In any case, Pasteur's next project was not to immediately seek cures for humanity's illnesses, but to defend the honor of France. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out, when the Museum of Natural History was bombarded, when Pasteur's new laboratory was threatened, and when Pasteur had to locate his own son in the mountains among the wreckage of his son's army unit, his sentiments turned against all things Prussian. So Pasteur turned his attention to what may have been a revenge project, making French beer better than German beer. His national pride may also have helped to eventually turn Pasteur back to the problem of human diseases. After seeing the success of Robert Koch, a disease-hunting German, Pasteur would later rededicate himself to the hunting of germs and the extermination of disease. He would eventually provide mankind with weapons of mass destruction against several deadly diseases, and by showing how vaccines could be made, he would inspire the creation of many more. In the saving of lives from deadly diseases, Pasteur would eventually become a titan, but only after someone else first proved the cause of infectious disease.